Imagine sitting at a small cafe somewhere between Bandar Abbas and the open sea. The ceiling fan spins slowly. The tea is strong, oversweet, the kind that stains the glass. Outside, across the shimmering Persian Gulf, three warships cut through water that used to belong, at least in the geopolitical imagination of Washington, exclusively to American power. The destroyer is Chinese. The frigate is Chinese. The supply vessel trailing behind it, fully loaded with provisions for a long campaign, is also Chinese. And in the heat haze of a gulf that just became the most explosive body of water on the planet, one question settled in the mind like sediment at the bottom of that tea glass. What exactly are the Chinese doing here? And what does it mean for the rest of us? That question turned out to be one of the most important questions of 2026. Not because of what was said in press releases or diplomatic statements. Those were, as always, carefully curated performances for a distracted global audience. The real meaning was encoded in hull numbers, in radar frequencies, in the quiet operational logic of a navy that had spent nearly 2 decades preparing for exactly this moment. And that moment had arrived. The story of how we got here did not begin on February 28, 2026, when joint American and Israeli strikes shook Tehran and reordered the entire security architecture of the Persian Gulf. It did not even begin in 2013, when Xi Jinping stood in Astana and conjured the ghost of the ancient Silk Road back into the vocabulary of global power. The story that placed three People's Liberation Army Navy warships in the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important energy choke point on the surface of the earth, had been unfolding for centuries, through empires and caliphates, through the age of sail and the age of steam, through the age of oil that defined the 20th century, and now finally the age of contested multipolarity that is defining the 21st. To understand China in the Hormuz, you have to hold two maps in your head simultaneously. The first is the ancient one, the maritime Silk Road, those old dhow routes connecting Quanzhou and Guangzhou to Hormuz and Aden and Zanzibar, routes that Chinese admirals like Zheng He sailed in enormous treasure fleets 6 centuries ago, before a different imperial logic turned China's gaze inward for 500 years. The second map is entirely modern, a flowchart showing the movement of crude oil and liquefied natural gas across the world's oceans, with one lane, the Hormuz lane, lit up in red, carrying roughly 20% of all global seaborne oil and nearly a third of all the liquefied natural gas the world trades in a single year. On that modern map, China glows brightest at the receiving end of those flows. Approximately 45% of China's entire crude oil import supply, the blood supply of the world's largest manufacturing economy, flowed through that narrow 34-kilometer wide channel in the years leading up to this crisis. When those flows stopped, China felt it in its spine. Now, here is what nobody in the Western press wanted to explain cleanly. China did not sail into the Hormuz crisis wearing a cape. It arrived carrying a calculator and a very complex set of competing interests that made its position simultaneously logical, paradoxical, and strategically fascinating. Beijing was Iran's largest trading partner. The comprehensive strategic partnership signed in 2021 had woven Iran into the Belt and Road Initiative's China Central Asia West Asia Economic Corridor, a framework that imagined Iran as a transit hub connecting the ancient crossroads of West Asia to Chinese markets. Beijing had invested years of patient diplomatic effort into this relationship, exchanging technology, financing, and strategic cover for the discounted oil that kept Chinese refineries humming through wave after wave of American sanctions. And yet, when the strikes came, when Operation Epic Fury lit up the skies over Tehran, Beijing watched from a precise, calibrated distance, evacuating its 3,000 nationals from Iranian soil while simultaneously avoiding any act that could be framed as co-belligerence. And here is the part that nobody talks about, but that actually decides the whole game. China pressed Iran quietly and firmly to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, not for the Americans, not for the coalition of 22 nations that signed a statement pledging to protect freedom of navigation. China pressed Iran to keep Hormuz open because China needed Hormuz open. The numbers are unforgiving. Qatar alone, whose LNG export terminal at Ras Laffan represents the largest single LNG facility on the planet, supplied approximately 30% of China's total LNG imports. When Iranian drone strikes forced Ras Laffan into its first full shutdown in nearly 3 decades of operations, Chinese energy importers did not reach for press releases. They reached for the phone and called Beijing, and Beijing called Tehran. This dual-track logic, warships in the strait, diplomats on the line, was the Chinese masterstroke of early 2026, and it was almost entirely invisible to the mainstream Western analytical community, which was too busy cataloging missile trajectories and debating the legality of Operation Epic Fury to notice what Beijing was actually constructing in the Gulf, because what China was constructing was not simply a deterrence posture. It was a new precedent, a new grammar of power, the grammar of a state that could simultaneously support a partner, pressure that same partner, profit from a crisis, and position itself as an indispensable broker, all without firing a single round. The specific vessels China deployed told their own story, and it was worth reading carefully because naval deployments are among the most honest forms of political communication. The People's Liberation Army Navy's 48th Escort Task Group had departed Qingdao, Shandong Province, in October 2025, part of China's unbroken rotation of naval presence in the Gulf of Aden and surrounding waters since 2008. A rotation that began under the cover story of anti-piracy operations and quietly became something far more geopolitically significant. By the time the Hormuz crisis erupted in March 2026, the 48th Group was already positioned at China's base in Djibouti, the small Horn of Africa nation that hosts Beijing's first and only declared overseas military installation. From Djibouti, the movement toward the Gulf was geometrically inevitable. The flagship of the group was the guided missile destroyer Tangshan, hull number D-122, classified as a Type 052DL, the most advanced iteration of China's Luoyang 3 destroyer family. The Tangshan was not a symbolic presence. It carried the Type 346A Dragon Eye active electronically scanned array radar, a dual-band system capable of tracking low observable targets with a precision that far exceeded the requirements of anti-piracy work, and was designed explicitly for high-intensity, state-on-state confrontation. Its vertical launch systems could field anti-ship, anti-submarine, and land attack munitions. The message encoded in that destroyer was not subtle, and it was not meant to be subtle. It was meant to be read clearly by any intelligence analyst sitting in a carrier strike group operations room in the Gulf of Oman. Accompanying the Tangshan was the Type 054A guided missile frigate Daking, hull F576, the workhorse of China's distant ocean operations program, equipped with HQ-16 medium-range surface-to-air missiles and anti-submarine rockets, a multi-role platform built for sustained independent patrols. And behind both combatants came the Type 903A replenishment ship Taihu, hull K889, the logistics backbone that turned this from a symbolic port call into a credible, enduring operational deployment. A combat group without logistics is theater. A combat group with a replenishment vessel is a statement of intent. China had sent a statement of intent. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this entire story, because Russia was already there. The corvette Stoichi had been threading its way around Africa for weeks, making port calls in the Seychelles, quietly positioning itself at the nexus of the crisis. And in the weeks before the February 28 strikes, Russia, China, and Iran had already conducted the Maritime Security Belt 2026 exercises, a trilateral naval drill centered on the Strait of Hormuz and the northern Indian Ocean that, in retrospect, read less like a routine annual exercise and more like a rehearsal for exactly the scenario that was now unfolding. The exercise, first held in 2019, had become a geopolitical statement disguised as maritime training. Russian presidential aide Nikolai Patrushev had been explicit about this, in a way most Western analysts reflexively dismissed as propaganda. He was not wrong about the underlying logic. The world's emerging power axis needed what Patrushev called a multipolar world order on the oceans. BRICS, he argued, needed a full-fledged strategic maritime dimension. The Hormuz exercises, in his framing, were not defensive reactions to Western pressure. They were constructive acts, the slow, deliberate assembly of an alternative security architecture for the waterways that connect the global South to itself. The BRICS Will for Peace 2026 naval exercises in the South Atlantic in January, involving Russian, Chinese, Iranian, Emirati, and South African naval forces, had already sketched the institutional blueprint. Maritime Security Belt 2026 was the field test. The detail nobody in the mainstream press wanted to discuss, because it complicated the clean narrative of China as either free rider or provocateur, was that Beijing was threading an extraordinarily fine needle. On one side, maintaining its partnership with Tehran, a BRI node, an oil supplier, a counterweight to American dominance in West Asia. On the other side, its massive economic exposure to the Gulf Cooperation Council states. China's bilateral trade with the GCC and Iraq had reached $344 billion in 2025. Beijing had invested in UAE ports, in Oman's Duqm facility, in Qatar's LNG infrastructure. Saudi Arabia, not Iran, was the single largest individual supplier of crude to Chinese refineries. Beijing maintained close strategic relationships on both sides of the strait, a diplomatic tightrope act that American policy, with its alliances and adversaries binary, seemed constitutionally incapable of performing. The real breaking point in this story starts right here, because the Hormuz crisis accelerated something that had been moving at evolutionary speed and suddenly lurched forward into revolutionary territory. Iran, having restricted the strait to unfriendly nations, introduced something extraordinary: a differentiated access regime. Ships from China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan were granted passage, and layered on top of this geographic differentiation was a financial one. Iran began charging yuan-denominated transit tolls for passage through waters that had been notionally free and open for decades. The world's most important energy corridor was now being run on Chinese currency. This was not a trivial detail. The petrodollar system, the arrangement cemented in a 1974 agreement between Kissinger's State Department and the Saudi royal family, under which global oil was priced and settled in US dollars, had been the single most powerful prop of American financial hegemony for 50 years. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency depended on the fact that everyone who wanted oil had to first acquire dollars. That circular logic had allowed Washington to run the global financial system on its own terms, impose sanctions with devastating effect, and freeze adversaries' reserve assets, and it had been eroding, slowly for years, through central bank gold purchases, bilateral trade deals in local currencies, BRICS quietly building alternative payment infrastructure. But March 2026 was different. March 2026 was the moment the erosion became a rupture. Indian refiners were settling Russian crude purchases in Chinese yuan and UAE dirhams, bypassing the dollar entirely. China's cross-border interbank payment system had processed the equivalent of $245 trillion in yuan-denominated transactions in 2025. Real operational infrastructure providing genuine settlement alternatives to SWIFT. Iran's Hormuz yuan toll was, in isolation, a wartime improvisation. But it landed on top of all this infrastructure and suddenly looked like something more: the opening move of a new financial geography. And here is the detail that decides the long game. Once a precedent exists, once a critical choke point has been monetized in a non-dollar currency, and the transaction confirmed through Chinese payment rails, the precedent becomes a template. The next crisis in the next choke point does not need to invent this mechanism from scratch. It activates a template already tested under the most extreme possible conditions. And here is a detail that nobody talks about, but that quietly decides the game over the long term. China was not actually panicking. In the weeks after the Hormuz closure, while South Korea's stock market crashed to levels not seen since the global financial crisis, while Japanese energy companies scrambled for alternative routes, while European wholesale gas prices spiked, China was managing. Its strategic petroleum reserves amounted to approximately 900 million barrels, roughly 3 months of imports, the world's largest stockpile. Its energy self-sufficiency rate stood at approximately 85%. Chinese tankers, 46 million barrels of Iranian crude on board, waited in the South China Sea, a floating buffer against short-term disruption, and China's diversified supplier network, Russia providing 20% of crude, the Western Hemisphere and Africa providing additional cushion, meant that the Gulf was critical but not irreplaceable in the short term. This relative insulation was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate strategic hedging of the kind that Chinese long-term planning excels at, and that American quarterly earnings cycle political culture structurally struggles to replicate. Beijing had spent years building redundancy into every energy supply chain, precisely against the scenario of Hormuz disruption. The BRI's overland corridors, the China-Pakistan economic corridor through Gwadar, the pipelines from Central Asia, the rail connections threading through Kazakhstan and Russia, were not just infrastructure investments. They were geopolitical insurance policies against maritime chokepoint vulnerability. But here's the paradox that made China's position so genuinely fascinating. Despite its reserves, despite its overland alternatives, China still needed Hormuz open. The 45% of crude imports that normally flowed through the strait could not be replaced indefinitely by overland pipelines lacking the throughput capacity. And the LNG exposure was arguably even more acute. There was no overland pipeline solution for the 30% of China's LNG imports that came from Qatar. So Beijing found itself in a structurally unprecedented position, simultaneously the most important partner of the state that had restricted the strait and the most important country that needed the strait reopened. It pressed Tehran privately while maintaining warships alongside American carrier strike groups. It negotiated passage rights for Chinese tankers while refusing to sign the joint statement demanding full freedom of navigation. It played both sides of the board simultaneously and did so with a composure that spoke of long preparation and longer strategic patience. Now, we arrive at what may be the most revealing dimension of China's Hormuz deployment, the part that shows what it was really about at its deepest strategic level. The physical presence of the Tangshan, the Daking, and the Taihu served multiple simultaneous functions, and only the least interesting of those functions was military deterrence in the traditional sense. Yes, the presence of Chinese warships reduced the probability of large-scale American strikes against Iranian targets in the immediate vicinity, because any planner in CENTCOM had to calculate the catastrophic diplomatic consequences of an inadvertent engagement with a Chinese naval vessel. That deterrence function was real, but it was almost a byproduct. The deeper function was informational. The Tangshan's Dragoneye AESA radar was not there to engage any target. It was there to listen, to observe, to map the electromagnetic signatures of every American and Allied naval asset operating in the Gulf, their radar frequencies, their communication patterns, their formation geometries, their response times. This was a masterclass in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, conducted in conditions no simulator could replicate, with the full real-world operational intensity of a live conflict environment. No amount of peacetime exercises could have provided what March 2026 provided: direct, unmediated exposure to American naval operational patterns under genuine combat stress. The second deeper function was institutional. Every coordinated maneuver in the Maritime Security Belt 2026 framework, every communication protocol established, every tactical procedure rehearsed between Chinese, Russian, and Iranian naval forces built interoperability that would be needed if the multipolar world they were collectively theorizing was to have any practical military meaning. These exercises were the construction of an alternative security architecture, piece by piece, ship by ship, protocol by protocol. the maritime equivalent of what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization had been doing on land for 20 years, slowly building the institutional sinews of an alternative international order that did not center on Washington. The great irony at the heart of this episode was that Washington's own strategy had created the very dynamic it found most alarming. The decision to weaponize financial sanctions, freezing $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves in 2022, progressively tightening the financial noose around Iran, had provided every non-Western capital on the planet with a visceral demonstration of what dollar dependency actually meant. It meant vulnerability. It meant that the infrastructure underpinning every financial transaction, every oil settlement, was infrastructure that Washington controlled and could shut off at will. The rational response was to build alternatives, and that is exactly what the Global South had been doing with methodical determination for a decade. The Hormuz crisis of 2026 was not the cause of de-dollarization, it was the accelerant. Consider what the Brazilian diplomats saw, what the Indian finance ministry calculated, what the Indonesian central bankers modeled. The crisis showed that the United States could trigger the largest energy supply disruption since the 1970s, and the dollar-denominated system could not insulate any of them from the resulting shock. The dollar had not protected them. It had made them dependent on the strategic decisions of a power whose interests did not necessarily align with theirs. Step back from the tactical noise, the daily strike reports, the carrier group positions, the diplomatic ultimatums with elastic deadlines. And what becomes visible in the Strait of Hormuz in March 2026 is something Halford Mackinder would have recognized as a civilizational pivot. The last time the world's major energy transit routes were reorganized around new power relationships was in the 1970s, when the oil shocks reshuffled the global energy order and produced the petrodollar system that defined the following half-century. Before that, the reorganization happened after the Second World War, when American naval supremacy replaced British imperial sea power as the organizing principle of maritime commerce. Each of those reorganizations took time. Each was messier, more contested, and more ambiguous in the moment than it appeared in the history books afterward. And each produced its share of conventional wisdom that turned out to be wrong. The analysts who saw only British decline and missed American ascent, the strategists who saw only Dutch commercial dominance and missed the British imperial synthesis quietly being assembled. The conventional wisdom of early 2026 in Washington, in Brussels, in the op-ed pages of the established Western press, was still processing the world through the conceptual frameworks of the post-1945 order. American military power as the ultimate guarantor, the dollar as the irreplaceable financial nervous system that conventional wisdom was encountering in real time, a reality it increasingly lacked the tools to describe. The Chinese ships in the Hormuz were not an anomaly in that old reality. They were an announcement of a new one. The Tangshan, the Daking, the Taihu, three vessels that most Western news consumers could not have named, carried in their hull numbers and radar frequencies and logistical endurance the weight of a geopolitical transformation larger than any single crisis, any single administration's policy choices. They were the physical expression of a country that had spent 40 years building economic mass, 20 years building institutional frameworks, BRI, SEO, BRICS, CIPS, and Bridge, and was now, in 2026, beginning to build the naval capability to defend that architecture on the seas connecting it to the world. Was China building deterrence, or was it building a new order? The more time you spent with the evidence, the more the question itself seemed like a false binary. Deterrence and order building are not alternatives. They are two phases of the same project. You build deterrence to create the space in which order building becomes possible. You build order, institutions, corridors, payment systems, port agreements, naval interoperability, so that deterrence never has to be activated because the alternative structures you have created make the old confrontational logic progressively less relevant. This was the patient, layered, historically informed strategic logic that had guided Chinese foreign policy since Deng Xiaoping counseled hiding capabilities and biding time in the 1980s. By 2026, the hiding was largely over. The biding was transitioning into acting, but the logic remained consistent: avoid direct confrontation with American power in domains where that power remains dominant, build alternative structures in the spaces where it is less decisive, use every crisis as an accelerant for those alternative structures, and maintain always the framing of a power that seeks only stability, commerce, and mutual respect. The world being assembled around those three ships, the world of yuan transit tolls and CIPES settlements and BRICS maritime exercises and BRI energy corridors and strategic petroleum reserves and Djibouti bases and Dragon Eye radars sweeping Gulf waters, was becoming real. Real enough to make a difference to every Indian refinery settling in yuan, to every tanker captain who knew which flag to fly for safe passage, to every Gulf state sovereign wealth fund quietly diversifying its reserve currency exposure, to every Central Asian republic calculating which great power's infrastructure offer to accept for its landlocked energy exports. So sit back in that imaginary cafe, drink the last of that oversweet tea, watch those three Chinese warships through the heat haze, and ask yourself the question this episode ultimately posed to everyone thinking seriously about the world. Was what you were watching the last act of the old order, or the first act of a new one? The historical record suggested that these transitions almost never announced themselves clearly in real time. The British Empire did not hold a press conference to announce its decline. The petrodollar system did not issue a warning that its structural foundations were shifting. Empires and orders change through the accumulation of events that look, in isolation, manageable. A naval exercise here, a payment system there, a transit toll at a choke point, a replenishment ship that stays longer than expected, until one day the accumulation crosses a threshold and the old frameworks no longer describe the world accurately. Whether that threshold was crossed in March 2026, whether the Strait of Hormuz would mark the moment historians later identified as the beginning of a new maritime order, that was the question that could not yet be answered. But it was the right question to be asking. And the fact that three Chinese warships were anchored in the most strategically important body of water on the planet, equipped with the most sophisticated electronic surveillance systems in China's naval arsenal, while tankers cleared for Chinese ports passed unmolested through waters blocked to American allies, all of that was evidence that the question was not abstract. It was happening right now, in real time, in 34 kilometers of shimmering, contested, historically freighted water between Oman and Iran. The Silk Road had always been a living thing. It had never stayed in one place, never confined itself to one medium. It moved across land when the seas were dangerous, across seas when the land corridors were controlled by hostile powers, threading through mountains and deserts and ports with the inexhaustible, pragmatic energy of commerce seeking its natural path. And now, in 2026, the new Silk Road had reached the water. The dragon had come to the strait. So here is the question that stays with you long after the cafe closes and the ships disappear into the haze. If the rules of the maritime world are being rewritten in real time at the Strait of Hormuz, who gets to hold the pen?